Okay, misconception number one, a PhD is the pinnacle of education. Now, most people think that the hierarchy of education goes like this. There's nursery school, primary school, and then secondary school. And some of us will go on to university and do an undergraduate degree. Some of those might do a master's degree, and then right at the top of that pyramid is a PhD. Now, in actual fact, this is wrong. A PhD shouldn't even feature on this list. That's because it's not actually the pinnacle of education. Instead, it's an entry-level ticket into academic research. Now, to understand what I mean by that, you need to know a little bit about how an academic lab is actually structured. So within an academic lab, there are various roles, all of which are important. There's the PI, and no, I'm not talking about a private eye, but a principal investigator. This is usually a university lecturer or a reader or a professor by their actual title. But what PI means is it's their lab, it's their research topic that the members of the lab all work on. And depending on how young or old the lab is, this person probably takes a more administrative role rather than actually coming into the lab and doing any experimental work. In fact, in some long-standing lab groups, if you were to see the PI walking into the lab and doing experiments, it is your duty to phone the police. Okay, next down we have the postdoctoral researchers, named postdocs for short, because they've completed their doctoral studies, they've completed their PhD. These are the ones actually performing the bulk of the research. They come up with ideas for experiments, they run the experiments, analyze the data, and write the papers. And they also get the pleasure of going off to international conferences, places like North Carolina, Hawaii, Brazil, to present their research. Okay, then one rung below the postdocs, we have the PhD students, desperately working on their own project and desperately struggling to get it finished before the funding runs out. Now, a thing to keep in mind, it's not always a smooth progression from PhD to postdoc to lecturer or PI. In fact, often PhD students take jobs as research assistants or research associates. This is a really handy role. It doesn't require a PhD, it requires an undergraduate degree, so it's useful for a PhD student who is writing up, because technically they can't be employed as a postdoc just yet because they're still pre-doctoral? Is that a term? Then we have some intermediate roles and some very rare roles. In terms of the rarer ones, senior postdoc. This is a position within an academic lab, but you rarely see them. And then we have research fellow. This is like an intermediate stage between postdoc and PI. In fact, before we end this segment, one more role I should mention is that of the research technician. Similar in a way to the research associate in that it doesn't require a PhD, but equally important, if not more so. You see, the research technician keeps everything running smoothly in the background. The equipment, the lab, keeps it tidy, keeps everything ticking over nicely. And they often do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to running the experiments as well. If you're a PhD student and you've pissed off your technician, you're in for a bad time. Okay, so in summary, a PhD is part of a separate hierarchy into academia, and in fact, it's the bottom rung of that hierarchy. However, because most people still think of it as the pinnacle of education, the result is a range of, let's say, unhelpful stereotypes and misconceptions. That brings us to number two. A PhD means you're the smartest person in the room. Now, only a person who has no idea what it's like to do a PhD would even think this. My old supervisor had a theory that high exam scores actually predicted lab success. Now, I often saw the opposite. Those who were less polished on paper sometimes thrived in the messiness of real experiments and trial and error, whereas those with impeccable exam scores sometimes struggled. Often, they crashed and burned after just a few experiments failed.
Oh, I'm sorry! Oh, I forgot to put a timer! I forgot to put a timer! All right.
Okay, so you might ask yourself, if it's not intellect that predicts success in a PhD program, what are those traits? Well, in my experience, these traits are resilience, adaptability, and a high tolerance for failure. And that last one is particularly important. It's the one you will get asked about in a PhD interview. I was asked about this. Give us some examples of when you've dealt with failure. I then went on to recount stories of when I was a teenager. My football team played matches every Saturday morning, and infamously, we went without a win for almost 2 years. To which the panel quite correctly responded, "Oh, okay, that's a very good example. So you're a complete loser." Interviews can be tricky. Okay, misconception number three. PhDs are egotistical know-it-alls. Okay, so we've just covered the fact that they're not the geniuses we sometimes think they are, but they sure do act like it, don't they? Well, in actual fact, you might be surprised to learn that most PhD students deal with something called imposter syndrome. This is a psychological pattern where individuals doubt their skills and accomplishments. Usually they fear that they're frauds and that they're going to be found out to be frauds, despite evidence of their own competence. Now, a recent study from Australia reported that 42% of PhDs experience imposter syndrome, so almost half. Now, thankfully, they found, it's not all bad news, the rates of imposter syndrome actually decline over time from first year until the year the students graduate. But if we put imposter syndrome to the side for now, PhD students and academics in general have other things to worry about. Unusually high levels of depression and anxiety. Up to 50% of postgraduate students report symptoms of whether it's depression, anxiety, or burnout during their program. So that begs the question, why are these symptoms, why are things like depression and anxiety so unusually high within academic circles? Well, the answer to that actually brings us back to the earlier misconception we talked about, the one about the PhD is just the next step in education on from the undergraduate degree. Now, consider that the majority of PhD students were probably high achievers in undergrad, and the shift to postgrad creates something called identity dissonance. Students start thinking to themselves, if I was so smart, why is this so hard for me? Maybe I'm not who I thought I was. You see, the failures they're now experiencing in the lab start to feel personal, starts to feel like incompetence. And getting the wrong answer back in undergrad, that meant missing the grade. That was a bad thing. But in a PhD, getting things wrong is actually essential for progress, and this is something a lot of PhD students don't appreciate. Now, all of this is made worse by a particularly nasty habit that some PhDs have, and that's comparing themselves to more senior members of the lab, like the postdocs, even the PIs. This is a problem that I struggled with myself during my PhD, early days, until I encountered this quote. Compare yourself with who you were yesterday, not with who someone else is today. Now, let me know down in the comments if you know who wrote that. Okay, misconception number 4. A PhD isn't a real job. This couldn't be more wrong. Now, for many people, it's more than a job. Long hours, self-driven, no scaffolding, very little support. It's actually closer to being an entrepreneur running a startup company than a real job, simply due to the variety of roles you have to perform. Also, when you consider that most PhD students take their work home with them, and let's be honest, why wouldn't you? Technically, it's your work, you're completely responsible for it. You could always be doing a little bit more, couldn't you?
I'm really behind the 8 ball, Mac. The mail doesn't stop, bud.
Now, unfortunately, this poor work-life balance will lead to burnout. I've seen it time and time again in academics. Burnout isn't quite as common in jobs with fixed hours, but remember, a PhD is a marathon, not a sprint. So in reality, it's one of the toughest jobs out there. Unless your PhD is you making a survey, spending the next 3 years talking about it, and somehow getting 67 publications out of it. Okay, that leads us to number 5, the final misconception. It was a tough slog, but now you've got your PhD. And a PhD guarantees respect, doesn't it? Well, unfortunately, like we said before, most people don't really have a great understanding of what a PhD is anymore. Some confuse it with being a medical doctor. Others think it's just another education degree where you studied in a library for a few more years, but you didn't really work as hard as them and their real job. Now, if we go back 50 years, we used to attribute huge respect to those with titles, such as doctor or professor. However, in recent years, particularly since COVID, we as a society are somewhat less trusting towards so-called experts. This can sometimes frustrate those with PhDs. They've worked tirelessly for years on end to earn that title, only to find that people refuse to use it when addressing them. And then you have the problem of there's no real way to broach that topic in conversation without reinforcing that stereotype that all PhDs are egotistical know-it-alls. Now, if you want my own personal stance on this, when it comes to official documents and particularly formal occasions, I make sure doctor is the title, not Mr. Now, the rest of the time, I don't lose sleep over it. A PhD is more than the title. It's about the skills and experiences you gained along the way. It's a transformational experience. Someone forgetting to refer to you as doctor, it doesn't rob you of any of that. Okay, so now that that's all cleared up, what did you think of those 5 misconceptions most people have about PhDs? Maybe you have some other ones that I didn't mention. If that's the case, then I want to hear from you down in the comments below. Now, if you're wondering what those skills were that I mentioned right at the end, the ones that most PhDs leave with some proficiency in, but when it comes to undergraduates, they never seem to learn these or master them at all, then check out the link in the description of today's video.